Give me a second, just that we have confirmation that we are live. Give me a second, just that we have confirmation that we are okay. And Rok,
yeah,
you take it away.
Okay. So welcome everyone and congrats for making it to the quarterfinal. My name is Rok and I'll be your chair and your timekeeper, and I will post the times in the chat: 1 minute, 7 minutes, 8 minutes. Apart from that, before we begin with the introductions of the panelists and the teams, let me just remind you that all debaters are strongly encouraged to have their cameras turned on, unless you're of course facing connection issues, then you may have them turned off. Okay, before we move on to the teams, I would like to give the opportunity to my panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'll go first. My name's Naomi. I'm from Canada. Sorry for the tech issues.
No worries.
Hi, my name is Orko. I'm from Canada as well.
Hi, my name is Lucas. I'm from the Netherlands.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm from the Netherlands as well.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all. Now we're moving on to the teams. On proposition, we have team China WSDC WeChat. And can I please get your speaking order? And if you want, you can also state your preferred gender pronouns.
Sorry, China is opposition, just to clarify before the round starts.
Okay. So let's start with the opposition team then.
Hi, I'm the first opposition speaker for China WeChat. My name is Shure, and preferred gender pronouns she and her. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Eddie. I'm going to be the second speaker and the reply for team opposition. I prefer he, him, and also verbal POIs. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Lynn. I'll be the third speaker for side opposition, and preferred pronouns are she, her. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And in proposition, we have team Croatia Red. Can I please get your speaking order as well?
Hi, I'm the first speaker, Lara. Preferred pronouns she, her, and I would like my POIs raised verbally.
Hi, I'm Patricia. I will be the second speaker and the reply. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and also my POIs verbally. Thank you.
And I'm Yarina, third speaker. I would also like my POIs verbally, and my pronouns are also she, her.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we begin, one other technical issue. Even after the debate is over, where do the judges go? Do they go to a breakout room, or do we stay here? Or okay, we'll figure it out this later. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite the first proposition speaker to open this debate. Here.
Okay, just checking, am I audible? Great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It's rather naive from governments that send international aid to think that giving money to oppressive, corrupt leaders of countries such as Congo, Myanmar, and Afghanistan will lead to any betterment of the people living there. To say, yes, you corrupt politician, do the right thing, we trust you, it's rather naive. Why giving it all to the NGOs is a better alternative, we will show you what are 3 substantives. First one about efficiency, second one about corruption, and third one that'll kind of our second speech about neglecting those who need help the most. But before doing that, let's do some few points of definitions and stance. So firstly, when you talk about NGOs, we talk about things such as Oxfam, Meridian, Sans Frontiers, and such. And these are not only international organizations, but they also work on a local level, meaning they have local offices, local people there and such. And they also are very branched, meaning they have local NGOs, and they send help there as well. So they're a huge organization, and they do things such as opening schools, giving electricity to people, helping them with agriculture and whatever business they do and such. When you talk about foreign aid that is given by governments, we tell you that this looks like a direct thing that leader gives a certain amount of money or food or such to another leader. This looks like the state that gave and sent aid to Croatia after the earthquake that we had last March. Sometimes this foreign aid is conditioned, meaning that the government that to who this is given needs to do better about human rights abuses and such. However, we believe that it is not mostly conditioned because the dictators simply do not accept that condition because they do not want to do so, and then no aid is given to the country that does not accept the condition. Now, what this debate is not about, it is not about IMF or World Bank or such organizations, because when we talk about these organizations, we believe that these are organizations that have indirect international aid, and because the motion simply stands that this is all about direct, we do not believe that this is about these organizations. Moving on to the first substantive about NGOs and how are they more efficient. So firstly, we have to note how do they operate. 4 points here. Firstly, they're stationed in one country, no thank you, and they prioritize the problem that is needed in that country. And they want to tackle it. Second of all, they're able to act fast. This is simply because they're so close and their involvement in the country that they are stationed in is very, very attached with everything that is happening there. And thirdly, the thing about NGOs is that locals trust them. This looks like this looks like the organization that is giving you food every day. The person that works in this NGO and gives you food, the locals are given these food, they trust these people, and they know that they can count on them, and they cannot count on their governments that were not able to provide them with sufficient aid and such. And fourth point about how the NGOs work, they have a unified goal. They have a unified version of what they're striving to do, what they're trying to achieve, and they want to stay in that country and to prolong however long it takes to fix the problem that they're there for. Now, comparatively, how do politicians of the government that is giving foreign aid, how do they operate? Firstly, we tell you that many of them work under the pretense of their own agenda. This looks like, oh, the president wants to be believed, wants to portray themselves as the giver of international aid, and this is the reason why he does this. Second of all, these governments simply sometimes give up. This looks like, for instance, they give up because they see that their intervention was not so efficient, so they just say, okay, we're not needed here. We need to move somewhere else where our help will be more needed. And thirdly, they're generally very slow because they take all of this process of bureaucracy. They have to go through all of those things, and this is why, because they're not in the closeness of the country that has needed this aid, they cannot operate as fast. No, thank you. Why is this so detrimentally bad? It's simply because the aid is then on the side of opposition not as efficient, because it cannot go there as soon as it can, and because it is not there for the longest amount of time. And this means that all of the people that need to be given aid are not given such. This means that more people will starve to death. More people will not have enough medication so they can survive to the next day. This means they will not be able to educate themselves or get a job because the aid was not going to be given to them. Comparatively, on a proposition, we tell you that NGOs, because they have 4 of all of these benefits that I've explained in the beginning of my substantive, because I explained to you that they are much more efficient, we believe that the aid will find its way to the people and will be given in much, much bigger efficiency. And this means that people will not going to be starved every day, and the betterment and the situation will get better. But also, this is principally correct on our side of the house, because the state that will give that will fund the NGOs will actually help the overall situation that is happening in the country that is given the NGO and the aid. And this is principally correct because these states that are going to give aid are the ones that are at fault for all of those that is happening because of colonialism, because they were the ones that exploited these countries. And now, because the aid is efficient, they will fulfill their principal duty to help these people. And this is what is happening on proposition. Moving on to the second substantive about corruption and how does No, thank you. Firstly, how does a process of sending direct international aid look like on the side of opposition? We tell you that this looks like this. The government that sends international aid gives the money, gives the food, gives the medicine to the leader of the other country. This means when we talk about countries that need international aid, we directly talk about oppressive dictators that are simply in power, forever, and they neglect everything that is happening in their country. They do not care enough for their people, and this is why they are so poor. And the country itself needs some aid. And this looks like, so for instance, when we give these people, when we give these people aid, this looks like this. This oppressive dictator will then put the money in his pocket, because he doesn't simply care about their people as he should, but he will just do this. This looks like, for instance, in Ethiopia, where they literally were given a certain amount of money from governments such as the US, and then they just put all of their money, no thank you, and send it to their ruling party. None of the money was given to the people that needed it. So why is that so detrimentally bad? Firstly, I explained to you the people do not get the aid that they need. But second of all, this makes these oppressed dictators more established, because it gives them an opportunity to stay in power, because it gives them literal money and with which they do not do anything. And this is principally bad, because we tell you that these countries that are going to give this international aid should not be just oppressing, should not be legitimizing the oppressive governments that are in place in these other countries. So comparatively, on our side of the house, because we give aid directly to the NGOs, and the dictator is not involved in the process, we have three things. Firstly, people do get this NGOs, and I'll explain to you why is that so good. But second of all, the corrupt leaders will eventually lose the power, because now people will not be as starving, because people will have more medication, and they will be able to do something in order to fight for their rights and such. And thirdly, it is principally correct, because the US is not then legitimizing the politician in power by saying, here you go, we trust you with this money, we believe that you will do the right thing. Because the sore reality in which we live is that these countries need help, but the help cannot be given through the oppressive leaders that are in power. We believe that proposition takes the debate. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the first speaker of the proposition. I'd also like to ask Ivan, Zip to mute themselves.
Oh God, sorry.
No worries. And now I'd like to invite the first speaker of the opposition.
Hi, can everyone see and hear me like this? Okay, thank you. Aid in the international community is rarely donated out of altruism. So all the incentives that Proposition gave you about things like conditions, unfortunately mean that on Team Proposition, you lose a huge chunk of aid to the extent in which you're forced to circumvent all of these abilities for them to have political purposes and force these individuals to donate their aid through NGOs in which they're no longer able to achieve their selfish means and ends. We think that on our side of the house, it doesn't matter how or why these governments are donating. The only thing that matters on our side of the house is that we get more aid on our side because we allow governments to have different channels and political channels to donate these forms of developmental and humanitarian aid. I'm going to talk about three main things in this speech. One, some pieces of framing. Two, on why governments have a greater capacity and ability to have aid. And three, why governments have better incentives compared to NGOs. So in terms of clarifications and framing, we have this. The first thing I want to clarify off the top of this debate is that Proposition cannot have a fiat to say that once you're forcing all governments to donate their aid through NGOs, they're still going to donate the same amount. We're going to prove to you in our speeches why the amount of aid that you're willing to donate donate as a government through NGOs drastically decrease on our side, and why that's a huge and harmful impact. And the second thing we'd like to clarify here is that humanitarian aid, they largely talked about in the Prime Minister's speech, already exists in the vast majority through NGOs in the first place, precisely because of the mechanisms they outlined. Because these are individuals who tend to be more localized, they understand the landscapes better, etc. The difference in the delta in this debate was developmental aid, these large-scale projects that are now largely conducted through governments that are forced to go through NGOs, or better yet, which are going to disappear on their side of the house. We think that is where the crux of this debate is going to take place. With that, I'm going to first go into some of the reasons why we think aid drastically decreases on their side. 3 reasons why that's the case. Look, unconditional aid and altruistic aid are going to exist on either side, so that's out of this debate. But there are 3 reasons why we're better able to get aid through political ends, and that goes away. 1, a lot of the political will for you to donate as a big developed country in the first place comes from your ability to say that I get some good out of this particular action on behalf of my government. It looks like, for example, maybe one day when we properly develop or prop up another country in another system, their economic stability that we allow for prospering on their side actually benefits us, because we may be able to be economic trade partners with them in the long term. That, for example, when we pursue stability on another side, that is actually beneficial to us, or when we pursue liberalization on another country, that is also beneficial to us. That political will of constituencies rely on things like selfishness and rely on things like you getting your way as somebody of a developed country. The second reason why aid is usually not altruistic is because they're usually conflicting political views and alignments. That, for example, the US may be very aware that Iran is in need of some kind of aid, but we're unwilling to do that unless they're able to say that we're going to donate this aid uniquely through the US government, because we want to have strings and conditions attached. We want to say that Iran can only receive our aid if they specifically bend to our specific requirements, for example, for them to lower their arms proliferation, for them to build certain trade deals or certain stability peace deals within that particular region. That if we do it uniquely through NGOs, we lose that bargaining chip and we're not going to donate to that particular country. And the third thing here is that in the international community, a lot of countries exist in aid exchanges purely for the purposes of favors and purely for the purposes of selfish ends that I outlined above, which means the sole principle they gave us on the idea of like accounting for old political colonialist past usually are ignored by the vast majority of states. You may have this burden, but usually as like a realist developed state, you're not going to abide by those particular burdens, even if people say that you have that. So the unique mechanism they gave to you on their side doesn't actually work. The bottom line of this particular framing that we're going to give you is that most aid on their side actually goes away, and that is a huge impact they have to deal with down the entire bench. On to our argument then. Let's first talk about the capacity and ability of governmental aid is uniquely better than NGOs. And the first thing to say here is that a lot of times aid needs to be delivered with political power. There are many reasons for that. Firstly, governments uniquely have a larger reserve of assets and dollars in terms of just tax revenue compared to a lot of NGOs, because NGOs rely on things like altruism, rely on individuals to want to donate to these things in the first place, whereas governments have huge chances of revenues for you to be able to donate that money elsewhere. So just in terms of how much money you have monetarily, governments are better able to engage in huge, large-scale projects that NGOs are rarely ever able to have. An example of this would be China connecting Kenya and Ethiopia through one railway that we do not see the equivalent or the parallel of conducted by just like another NGO like Oxfam, because they simply were not able to engage on projects that large of a scale. So I think uniquely, we only get that on the side of governments. A second reason why that's the case is simply because we have more workers and contractors that we're able to mobilize huge amounts of individuals, whereas on your side, you can only recruit small amounts of individuals because you're more localized, as they conceded in their first speech. But the third thing we'd like to clarify for you here, and this is extremely important, is that we're able to combine political tools along with economic aid. That we have jurisdiction and power to say, for example, to send diplomats and to broker deals so that they're able to have things like intercontinental networks. They're able to have trade deals within those particular areas. The examples we're going to put to you here is how China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, they're able to have they're able to connect certain African countries next to each other and build things like railways and markets that connect these individuals together. And this takes a huge amount of political power to be able to broker, to say that we are going to enforce these kinds of trade political unions and these kinds of trade deals uniquely because it is a government and government negotiation. And you're unable to do that as an on-the-ground actor, as an NGO activist, for example, because you simply do not have that kind of political leverage and that kind of political jurisdiction. And this is a crucial impact the opposition is able to get on our side, because intercontinental networks and trade policies is extremely important for the development of an entire region as a whole. Then you usually need to have things like development across all of your neighbors for you to grow together as a union, for you to grow together as neighbors. But on their side, individualized small amounts of aid is rarely able to get that kind of thing. So we outweigh them. But also, we get a positive feedback loop on our side that also engages with things like NGOs also increasing their aid. Why is that the case? Because if China is able to have things like the state-sponsored Belt and Road Initiative, when you fund things like education and universities, and people see the people that you're donating to as brothers or allies of your particular country, that is when charities and NGOs that are based in China are more willing to donate aid and galvanize individuals to donate for their foundations to go into those particular countries, because there's already an alliance that is portrayed there by your state actively sponsoring that particular trade deal. So if they talk to you about why all the reasons why NGOs are good, we tell you why particularly this feedback loop also exists on our side when states actively sponsor this particular deal. That is why states have the better capacity and incentive to be capacity and ability to be able to do it. The second main clash and argument I would like to posit on opposition is that governments overall have better incentives and accountability mechanisms for you to overall deliver higher transparency and higher quality as a whole. Two things under this. One, let's talk about the mechanism of competition. We think that governments overall, when they compete with each other for things like reputation, on the global stage. Sorry?
We didn't
yeah.
30 seconds. We're really sorry. Like,
oh, yeah, sorry, let's pause the time. And
sorry, yeah, what you're saying, Croatia, I paused the time.
We didn't hear like the 20 seconds before the second clash and then the beginning of the second clash. We're really sorry.
Oh,
could you please
okay, yeah. Could you just remind me what the last thing you heard was? Let me go back.
About regional development, that part.
Like how NGOs are more willing to then invest and give aid to countries that are politically aligned through governmental aid.
Oh, okay, got it. So I would just start from that point and then.
So yeah, that was a 6-minute mark. So I will restart the time at 6 minutes, and I'll be.
Right.
I won't be too
cool.
strict when you get to.
Thank you. Sorry again.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so 6 minutes. So I'll just do like. All right, cool. So I'll just begin now. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes. Yeah, we can.
Okay, cool. So the positive feedback loop that we outlined to you under our first argument basically talked to you about why when you have the active state-sponsored ability for you to say another country is our alliance, another country is our brother, when we fund things like education, you also proliferate the ability and the incentive for smaller scale NGOs based in China to be able to donate to those countries to allow for individuals to see that country as more palatable and responsible for helping them. On to our second clash then, let's talk about the idea of the incentives, comparing governments and NGOs. And the first thing under this is the mechanism of competition. We think largely on the international stage, governments do have an incentive to compete with each other to seen as the most beneficial country and the most powerful country on the international stage. What does this look like and why is that good for aid? It looks like, for example, during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union competed in Truman's Marshall Plan to see who can give the most aid into Eastern Europe and see who was able to have the greatest amount of infrastructure development in those particular areas. And we think uniquely when you have competition on a large scale like that, you overall get more qualities and quantities of aid into countries that need that. Similarly, currently, you also see the competition between China and America, that these countries both go into Southeast Asia and African states so that these countries are able to choose between different countries and things like that. So we think uniquely when you have competition on a large scale between governments, they're also able to go into different countries. And this also elevates the power and the leverage that developing countries have in terms of choosing which form of aid they're able to adopt. So this also addresses their argument that if one side was uniquely so coercive and had so many strings attached that you were unwilling to take it, you can always choose another form of aid because governments are going to compete with each other. And the second mechanism we have here is accountability. That uniquely then, states have a long-term incentive to want to develop economically their alliances. That, for example, when states are able to go into this particular country, like let's say, for example, Hungary or Greece, note that countries like France and Germany are much more willing to donate long-term and abundant amounts of aid into those countries because they think that developing these kinds of countries are beneficial for them in the long term. They're able to have a stable political union. They're able to have things like strong governmental interconnected economic trade networks. On the comparative, NGOs do not have the similar mechanisms because they do one-off things and they do not care about the long-term development. And they're always able to cover it up with PR stunts. So at the end of the day, we've proven to you why A, aid decreases on their side of the house. B, we have a greater capacity to build things that are very, very drastically important. And C, we have better incentives. And for all the reasons above, very, very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition speaker, and now I'd like to invite the second speaker of the proposition.
Hi, sorry, just 1 second. Okay, I'm gonna start in, can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay, sorry. I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. Not recognizing the fact that by going for international aid, we're just putting the money directly in the pockets of those who want to keep their people just fed enough for them not to rebel is the main problem of the side of opposition in this debate. Here to prove to you again why we can only have these countries by proposing. Here's what's going to happen in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to go over our points, how they were never properly rebutted, and clash them with the points made by the side of opposition. And lastly, I'm going to introduce our third substantive, which talks about how help is neglected for those who need it most. Okay, so the whole basic idea and everything the side of opposition basically talks to us about in their first speech is about how only on their side of the house are they actually going to get more aid. Okay, so few things that they talked about and why they are inherently not true. You talk about the fact how political will is actually the reason why they're going to do it, and here comes the entire analysis of how this is never going to be altruistic. The fact is that in the status quo, it is altruistic. One of the biggest donors in the world is in fact the European Union, who is doing it for no other reason than their altruistic reasons, because in fact the voters and the Western values of the people inside the European Union are they want to see these countries being helped, and this is why they're voting for them. There's absolutely no incentive here. The fact that you tell us that they're doing this for some sort of economic ties or trades, please, the US nor the European Union don't need a new trade partner in Uganda. This is an unrealistic portrayal, and this is not the reason why they're doing it. So it is incredibly important to understand that it can be inherently altruistic. But furthermore, let's realize that even if it's not inherently altruistic, there are different mechanisms here. For instance, the fact that the US is pushing money through NGOs and such is also showing that they are working the very best, and this helps people understand, be more inclined to believe Western values and actually show support for the US and so on. The fact is, your entire principle is contingent on the fact that this is actually the best way that people are getting help. Thus, if we manage to prove that on our side of the house, the help is better, then your principle no longer stands, because yes, the US does want support from people there, and people there should need to be helped, but only on our side of the house are we actually doing it. Furthermore, you have this really big point about the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm here to tell you a few things about why this actually makes no sense on your side of the house, because the fact, because the fact is that the Belt and Road Initiative was actually a way from China to get countries to be trapped by giving them huge loans and huge debts that they will never be able to pay out. For instance, Laos, who had to declare bankruptcy because of projects that they will never be able to pay out because China was telling them, oh, I'm actually going to help you in this way. And that's the same thing that's actually happening in Africa and all these projects that you were talking about, because these dictators actually like to be under the arm of China and like to be held by China, and that is why they are working. And this mechanism is exactly the mechanism that keeps corrupt political leaders in power. And this is something that you never engage with on our side of the house. On the other hand, when you're telling us that these countries will always be inclined to accept help if it is conditioned, and this is the only way they will actually change. Again, a reality check when Iran actually a few years ago, when there was a huge crisis, did not accept help that was offered by the US and which was conditioned exactly because of the fact that they did not want ties to the US. They did not want to owe anything to the US. Comparatively, on our side of the house, NGOs get to infiltrate themselves locally. They employ local people. They don't have a stamp that says this is US money on their forehead, but rather they can actually help in more discreet ways. And we have given you so many reasons in our first substantive why they're so much more likely to do so, which was never ever engaged. So let me say again, first of all, they can have total focus on one country. They are not conditioned by one mandate that lasts 4 years and where one leader wants to see that he actually made some sort of change, and if nothing changes in 2 years, then he just quits. They can
for 15 years only help one country. Secondly, there is no bureaucracy, there's no time frame, and thus things go faster and better. And thirdly, really important, they are actually on the ground. The NGOs are there within the people. They know exactly how to help. They have that help. For instance, in Kenya, solar tablets that are used with kids in schools, or UNICEF that is providing malaria nets on the ground to help people against this disease. While a country such as the US has thousands of agendas, the NGOs have one, and thus they are so much more able to actually help. But when we're talking about the entire idea of incentives, the fact is that on your side of the house and under everything you're saying, there basically is no longer any competition, because of the fact that China is just trapping everyone because it is the biggest donor in the world with the Belt and Road Initiative and everything else. But why, even if we were to say that what you're saying is true, then why on our side of the house wouldn't countries suddenly just be competing as to who is making the most difference and who is giving the biggest help? And we're telling you that only on our side of the house can that help be made. And when you give us the example of the Cold War, how it was great that countries were fighting for power and
Okay, Croatia, you're cutting off. So can you hear me? I did stop the timer. Croatia Red. Eta, are you here? Yeah, can you please contact Croatia Red? And I think that was a yes.
Is there an issue?
Yes, Croatia Red is having connection issues. They are reconnecting now.
Okay. Problem.
I get them. They are telling me they're trying to reconnect. They need about 3 minutes to do so because they're not in the Zoom anymore.
Okay, we'll wait.
Hi, we're so sorry. Can you hear us?
We can hear you.
Okay, yeah, I'm again
No,
so sorry.
It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Okay, so whenever you're ready, you may begin. The time will be 5:20, and you stopped at rebutting opposition's argument on competition, and you said they mentioned the example of Cold War, and then we heard nothing.
Okay, sorry. So you said 5:20.
Yes.
Okay, so that means I have. Okay. So they give us the example of the Cold War, where we can basically see that the US and other countries started proxy wars in countries that still haven't been able to recover themselves. So I don't see why this competition would actually be something that's beneficial for the people there. And that should be our end goal in this debate, to actually get help to those who need it most. And that can only be done on our side of the house for the reasons that were never rebutted. Now let's talk about the three main principles in this debate and how we are the only side that actually defends them. The first one being that we have the duty to help the most people, which means doing work without having the barrier of there being leaders which are not gonna help everyone, which will be talked about in my third substantive, and moreover without doing work with leaders who might or might not accept conditions, but rather with NGOs who we can rely on and be sure of. The second, that when presented with the choice, we shouldn't prioritize those countries who don't support any of our values and crack down on human rights, because the people of America or any other country who are actually whose taxpayers' money we are actually using to fund all of these NGOs or any sort of help are ones that believe in liberty and human rights. So they will be incredibly angry when they realize that
that this is in fact going in the pockets of corrupt leaders who are doing nothing to help their people. So the country is failing the citizens from which the money comes from. And thirdly, if you're constantly just funding international aid, but nothing is actually changing, that means that people will be more inclined to believe that foreign help doesn't help at all, meaning that they will stop believing in any sort of these values and stop believing in any chance of progress or change. All of this means that they will be even more left to themselves. Having said all this, I move on to our third substantive, which talks about neglecting help for those who need it most. Because the fact is that when characterizing these countries, we need to be aware of the fact that they generally don't want their people to get better, in the sense that they want them to be just fed enough, just not hungry enough, to be sort of happy with how they are ruling the country, but not in fact get enough to become independent enough to raise any sort of rebellion or to go against them or to show or to pick any other ruling party. But moreover, these leaders have specific minorities that they don't even that whose votes or support they don't need to stay in power at all. Let's take some examples of it. The Shia Muslims in Pakistan, the Muslims in India, the Muslims in Myanmar, Kurds everywhere, gays and women everywhere in these countries, Palestinians in Israel. These are all groups which, even if a leader, if a dictator were to accept the money from international aid, he would never direct the funds towards
It's okay, we can hear you.
Na koji si internet spojena? Did you?
It's okay, we heard everything. I stopped the time.
I'm sorry, you were totally frozen. I thought you couldn't hear anything. I'm sorry.
No, just it was your video. So maybe if you try turning off the video for the next speeches, I think it might work better. But now, like, feel free to conclude the speech. We heard everything.
Sorry, I'll continue. Okay. So comparatively, on our side of the house, those who need help the most will get it, because NGOs don't put favorism, and they don't actually think that, oh, just because the corrupt leader doesn't hates gays, we're not going to help gays. They help everyone within the country. And secondly, the biggest difference is that these people are now the most uplifted out of poverty, more than they could ever be on your side of the house, and they can become productive members of society, help the country economically and every other way. And thus, for all of these reasons, please propose.
I'd like to thank the proposition speaker, and I'd like to give the floor to the second speaker of the opposition.
Hi, am I audible, visible, all good? And Croatia, is everything cool? Just great. You may think that our worldview on international relations is cynical, but the unfortunate truth is that's what reality actually looks like. That a lot of the times it is not the goodwill of countries, but rather the political incentives that pull on the leaders like puppet strings that actually make the world go around. We hate playing the game too, but the fact of the matter is to say that winning that game, the reward is saving lives, the lives that we save on our side of the house. The problem with Croatia so far is that the only thing they prove to you, literally the only thing they prove to you, is that NGOs are better humanitarian aid. We can concede all of that and still win this debate because of the fact that they do not understand the very simple framework that my first speaker gave you, that NGOs having humanitarian aid is a fundamentally different service than governments pushing development aid, and they have to tell us as to why stripping off that type of international assistance to other countries is something that is justified and something that is good for the global south. Two things in this debate then. Firstly, on the comparative between development and humanitarian aid, and secondly then on the capacity and incentives of governments versus that of NGOs. Firstly, on development versus humanitarian aid. Listen, the poor push that we had on our side of the house is that the only change in incentivization you get is when you look at the development aid that is going out because altruistic and unconditional aid is going to happen in the status quo. We told you why this was a large majority of most of the aid that's probably going out. That most of it is not going out because of the goodness of the heart, but most of it is going out because of political reasons. We told you firstly, in terms of quid pro quo, that they want something back. We told you secondly, contradictory ideological forces that mean that you do not help countries unless there is a political gain to have there because you guys are not on good terms in terms of a diplomatic level. And thirdly, because a lot of times local priorities outweigh. No, thank you. So when they talk about, for example, the only response being that EU citizens like democracy, even if EU citizens are so great, what happens, for example, when a pandemic hits and all of a sudden you care about your own economic interest rather than giving money to Uganda or giving money to Uzbekistan? Or what happens when a wave of nationalism comes up? The important thing to know about altruism, and when it comes from the public will, is that it's incredibly flimsy. On our side of the house, the realistic mechanism we gave you, which is that a political incentives, is something that's always going to exist. So we harness that greed, we harness that selfishness to help other people. But listen, no thank you. Even if altruism did exist, I have two reasons as to why it actually doesn't impact this debate. The first is to say that even if altruism exists, it does not extend to development. So maybe altruism does exist if you feel incredibly bad because Indonesia just got hurt by an earthquake. But altruism does not exist if you're trying to help a country build a new railroad, because it seems as if there's less urgency in that sense. So people on the ground do not feel the same sort of heartstring pulling that they think is the mechanism on their side of the house. But secondly, because we told you that when altruism exists, it goes through NGOs in the status quo. Humanitarian aid already goes through NGOs. And I think there were three reasons as to why this is true. Firstly, in terms of investigation. So United States and other countries who have aid make sure that they go through non-corrupt, ethical means to be able to make sure that it actually gets distributed to the people. Because if they're spending their money, they want to make sure that it's being used in a correct way. So it probably does go through trusted NGOs anyway. Secondly, because everything they told you that these countries don't want to fail their citizens by saying that we're giving away aid basically to dictatorial governments, people that are antithetical to our view in our mind. So I think in that sense, they wouldn't want to give to, for example, the president of Uganda if he's just going to take all of the money because of the backlash that will come. But thirdly, in terms of international cooperation, because if you're helping somebody after an earthquake or after a pandemic or because of some widespread disease or something like that, then probably a lot of countries are going to come together and pool aid, which is why you need a neutral third party NGO to give it. All of this is to say that everything they told you about why NGOs are better humanitarian aid is totally fine for us to completely accept, because all of our things are going to be going through there anyway. But I want to talk about development aid something very quickly. The only reason that they, with them giving very little response. Why is development aid so important in this debate, and why is our guarantee of it good? Because even if they prove that development aid is less ideal if governments do it, we prove to you why it's literally non-existent on their side of the house. Firstly, in terms of long term, so these countries, the best world is one in which countries do not have to rely on aid. And if you allow a country to develop to the terms in which they don't need aid in the future, that is better. Secondly, because development is incredibly important for democratization, as in when your people are better educated, when they're more wealthy, when they have more of their needs met, they're better able to organize, they're better able to think of their political rights. Thirdly, in terms of economic evolution, in that a lot of these countries are transitioning from a primary to a secondary economy, or a secondary to a tertiary economy, from going to agriculture to industry, or industry to service. So in that sense, then, this development is incredibly important to both break out of the middle income trap, but to make sure that citizens can have better life standards overall. So we get that on our side of the house. But secondly, I want to have a discussion about tyrannical governments and corruption. The first thing I'd like to note is that it's incredibly offensive to basically imply that every single less economically developed country is an authoritarian government. And I think this is an incredibly horrible framing when you look at the vast majority of countries that we do donate to, places like Malaysia or Indonesia or India or Pakistan, places that might not be the strongest democracy in the world if you compare them to like Norway, but are still democratic in their sense and are not just going to take blatantly from the people. The reason why you know this framing is better is because if you look at their conception of the world, the entire debate falls apart. Because if the actual premise is that these governments are so oppressive, then I do not know why they would not be equally as oppressive to NGOs. So even if they are local, for example, it doesn't mean that the government cannot still tax these NGOs or, for example, send local representatives to take the money right out of the NGO's hands. I would say that if I was a tyrannical government, I would be much more ready to take from its little NGO than I would to literally steal money from the US government, money that was supposed to be given to me. If I have to compare the military strength of the strongest government in the world versus like the Red Cross, I'm a lot more scared of stealing from the United States. So in that sense, I do not know why they have any efficacy there. But I also think the false premise is that stability in terms of not rebelling is an incredibly strong motivation, and that you do want to develop your country to make sure that your citizens do not revolt, because the premise of authoritarianism is that you can provide people a stable life. Secondly, then, I want to talk about why governments are better in capacity and incentive, but before I go on, I'll take that point.
You do realize by saying that NGOs actually do most of the work anywhere, you're conceding to our side that this is better. And in fact, basically just proposing the motion by saying, yeah, we want government to give money to NGOs to do it. So almost it.
Your burden is to prove that all money goes to NGOs. Our burden is to prove that money goes to NGOs when NGOs are better handled at it, but we can still reserve other parts of money to go to other things that the government can do directly, things that NGOs cannot do. Your burden was to prove absolutism. Our burden is to prove why that is not the best option. Secondly, then, on capacity versus incentives, right? So we told you as to why, even if NGOs did have the incentive to develop a country, why that would never happen in terms of the resources and labor deficiency that they have, of having less money on hand, of having less workers and less contractors that are able to put into work network, the infrastructure that is needed to develop these countries, but also the unification of political measures that was incredibly important to make sure that you could have these regional trade blocks. But secondly, that I want to talk about incentives, because this is something that they talked about when they said why development was bad, specifically talking about the BRI. The important thing to note about accountability in terms of when governments give development aid is that the leverage stands almost entirely within that of the developing countries. So the only thing they tell us as to why development is bad is because China sets debt traps with no analysis as to why they do that. I would give you two reasons as to why, even if they did do that in the past, the evolution of the development means that's something that's not going to be likely in the future. Firstly, development projects for these developed countries are based off of PR, as in after Malaysia and Indonesia threatened to pull out because of the exploitative nature of the BRI in the genesis of BRI, it is when China decided to reevaluate its policies and to make sure that it gave off less money for vanity projects. It made sure it gave out more transparent terms so they can incentivize other countries to join, such as Italy. And I think this is incredibly important because governments usually have more scrutiny placed on them when you compare them to NGOs. But secondly, in terms of mutualism, because you want global blocks and connections. And this is very important because for something like the BRI, for example, it only works if you have a complete land route or a complete connection between the entire Asian continent. So in that sense, if one country pulls out then because they do not consent or they feel that you're being exploitative, then you lose all of your leverage there. So because these countries still hold that leverage because it's based off of both PR, but also the connection and mutualism that we only get on our side of the house is the reason as to why the development always comes from a good place of heart. So the only comparative you have to think in this debate then is whether or not development is still important. We say yes, incredibly proud to stand in opposition.
I'd like to thank the second speaker of the opposition. We now continue with the third speaker of the proposition.
Am I audible?
You are audible. You may begin when you're ready. I would suggest that you turn off the video in case you get. Yeah, so begin when you're ready.
Side opposition loses this debate when they concede that NGOs are the most efficient, and on their side, all the efficient money will be going to NGOs anyways, because that is what we are debating. We are debating money going to NGOs. We are debating more money in NGOs. We do not have to prove that all the money we have today goes to NGOs, because even if we prove a little money goes to NGOs, we take this debate because we prove that direct help is just inefficient completely. First of all, let us characterize these countries, developing countries that we are helping. They are either authoritarian regimes or weak democracies, both which are riddled by corruption. So either way, even if it's not an authoritarian regime, we are giving this money to a corrupt, weak democracy leader who still does not respect human rights. Okay, now on to the question of incentives for countries. First of all, we have the fiat that the countries will donate at least some money to these NGOs. Secondly, we say that the only incentive in the EU is altruistic, no matter how much you try to rebuttal on that, because EU has no incentive to trade with Uganda. They don't need Uganda as a trade partner. Third of all, we believe that the incentive for countries here is when the incentive for countries here is competition, like you said, they will just change their competition to competing who will donate more to NGOs. So on either side, countries have incentive. And we think that this incentive to donate to NGOs is better than the incentive they have to help on your side, because in this way, because NGOs are much more efficient, with the 4 reasons that still have not been rebutted on that you conceded, because they are there physically, they can react quicker without the bloated bureaucracy, and the locals trust them more and are more willing to accept help from them because they literally know these people personally, and these NGOs know exactly what the problem is because they are there, so they can help better and more targeted, and they can have more long-term help because these people in governments, they need to prove during their mandate that something is successful, while NGOs can focus on smaller help on education, which will later grow into bigger things. But first of all, development aid. Development aid still exists on our side and can exist through the IMF. So this is not something exclusive to your side. Secondly,
The West won't invest in countries where the BRI already claimed, which is bad. Why? But now let's explain why the BRI is actually negative. First of all, these countries don't need the infrastructure that creates jobs only from the Chinese, tax from that infrastructure that goes to their corrupt governments that will use to strengthen their rule, strengthen their dictatorship, and will not invest it back into their people. And they do not need China to seize that infrastructure because they are in such crippling debt that they cannot repay it back. And then China can use that infrastructure for political power. And if anything, through the BRI example, you prove that self-incentivized direct foreign aid is actually harmful. And this is why another reason why we shouldn't have this self-incentivized direct foreign aid. This is another reason why NGOs are much better, because we do not have this self-incentive that is actually harmful. Also, now next, why on development aid a bit more. We do not think these countries need necessarily developmental aid. These people need to be educated and lifted out of poverty, which NGOs can do there on the ground. NGOs there on the ground start schools. They lift people out of poverty by helping them with agriculture and specific initiatives. This is something a corrupt government will never do for a few reasons. First of all, these corrupt governments do not have the incentive to help their people. They have the incentive to help their people, keep them in poverty just enough so they're not going hungry. And if they keep their people like this, they're able to stay in power because this is just enough so the people don't start a revolution. And secondly, this development aid that we get from the NGOs, such as education, will later help people, raise people out of poverty, and will actually make the economy develop. You said how these countries are transitioning from a primary to secondary and tertiary industry. This is where education is the most crucial. This is where people need to follow the technological developments in their country with their education, with with developments in their culture and so on. This is why NGOs are much better at helping these countries in developmental aid in the end of the day as well, because we do not need new roads. We first need education. We first need people to go through this transition mentally and culturally. And then lastly, because NGOs will be pushing this education, which is something that is crucial in authoritarian states, we think further down the line, long-term, a reform of the state will happen because people will realize what Western values are, what their rights are, and therefore they will want a reform of the state. But lastly, why we think NGOs have survived in dictatorships when foreign aid, direct foreign aid, is either goes only to the dictators or is completely declined. Because NGOs have the ability to infiltrate and detach from Western values enough that the dictatorship does not see them as a threat. But even if they do not do that, dictatorships usually do not see NGOs as a threat, as we can see in the Philippines, which declined help from America, but still have many NGOs working there. Lastly, on regional trade blocs. This, first of all, does not depend on foreign direct aid. And secondly, first of all, we need an incentive for trade. We need to develop the country enough for it to be a beneficial trade partner. And we, like we already explained, we only develop the country when we have education, when we have this sufficient and efficient NGO aid. And so we think that our alternative is much better, and that your comparative is a new Chinese neo-colonialist power with just, but even if our alternative is just a little bit of help. Okay.
Hi, sorry. Our op whip just dropped. Kind of tit for tat internet situation.
Okay, don't worry. I stopped the timer. We'll wait for the op whip.
Yeah. I think the last thing, when she comes back in, maybe she can let us know what the last thing she heard.
Okay. Great.
Hi, I just got back in. Really sorry. Can someone just say something so I can see if I can
Hello,
hear?
we can hear you.
Oh, okay. I think it works. Sorry, so sorry for the disruption.
No worries. Can you just tell us what's the last thing you heard so that the proposition third speaker can start back at the same point? Okay, great. Laura said that she posted 5 minutes. So, Jacqueline, can you just remind us what was the last thing you heard, so it would be a bit easier for the third prop?
Yeah, the last thing I heard is that NGOs are seen as detached from like a political entity or a country.
Okay. Third prop, can you continue from there?
Yeah.
And you have like, it's 5 minutes on the timer.
Okay. Then I will start again. So basically, these NGOs are not seen as such a threat to dictatorships because they are detached from these Western values that dictatorships should see so much as a threat, especially if these are from international NGOs and not sent from a specific country, or if these are local NGOs that infiltrated local communities. Lastly, on trade blocks, this first of all doesn't depend on direct foreign aid, and also if the purpose of the aid is just if your aid is just to make better trade, then you can just donate to the IMF if there is no geopolitical purpose with what you do, and then the IMF can build up better trade paths. So you proved that these are all geopolitical purposes, which gives us a neocolonialist China, which we really do not want. And even if our alternative is just a little bit of help and less help, we think that our alternative is better. But now, lastly, we would like to bring back our third argument, which is not rebutted on, which talks about the most vulnerable people in these countries. These are like the Muslim minorities in Pakistan. These are women in many countries. These are the LGBT community in many countries, which is under these countries that do not respect human rights. These communities are most burdened with all the things that our NGOs are trying to solve. On your side, because you are giving this money directly to the country, it will never be invested in these people, in these most vulnerable people, because of the country's ideology and standings. They will never invest into these vulnerable people. And because we invest into these vulnerable people and enable women to work as well, enable all of these vulnerable communities to work and to participate in economy, we think that also will contribute to better economic growth on our side. Lastly, our principles have stayed untouched this whole debate. And these are a few. First of all is the principle that America or any other country cannot donate directly to a government that completely clashes with their values and the values that their taxpayers support. Because this is clashing with what your taxpayers support, and you're supporting someone discriminating women in another country when the taxpayers in your country are all for women's rights. And secondly, because people will realize that this direct foreign aid is not helping, even though they've been getting it for the past 20 years, people in these developing countries, they will stop trusting direct foreign aid altogether and be less open to accepting any kind of foreign aid, whether it's NGO or whether it's from the states. This from the state, direct foreign aid. And this is why we think foreign aid can only be efficient on our side, because of the efficiency of NGOs, because these people because of the corrupt governments who we just cannot let have this money, because we are helping the most vulnerable people, because we are the only ones who have the principle on our side, and because we are the ones who help these people most efficiently, and we help these people who are most vulnerable in these states. So lastly, I would like to go over, and your comparative is self-incentivized governments that use these countries for geopolitical gains, corrupt governments that do not give these people, these most vulnerable people in their countries, the money, the help that they need, the corrupt and corrupt governments that do not care for their citizens, do not care for, and this is why I believe that side proposition takes this debate.
I'd like to thank the third speaker of the proposition. Now I'd like to call upon the third speaker of the opposition.
Hi, can you see and hear me like this?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Great. Side proposition has never really engaged with side opposition in this debate because they refuse to acknowledge that this debate isn't about, oh, do we want to create two fictional worlds and compare them where one is only government funding to another country and one is only NGO funding to another nation. They're the ones cutting off one type of funding, which is the international aid between governments, but the status quo that opposition can define is one in which non-governmental organizations fundraise through individual donors, and they still exist and operate exactly the same on our side, whereas governmental aid comes from a whole different source of revenue, which is a tax revenue that still exists. All the benefits still exist on our side. We're just giving you an extra aid on top, extra help on top, and as long as there's a unique benefit, Team Opposition already won this debate. The refusal to acknowledge the real world is the failure of side proposition. A few clarifications before three clashes. One, the support of IMF is a huge concession on their side because essentially, even though the money is distributed through IMF, it is exactly credited from the US, it goes to IMF, and it goes to Greece, government to government. So it's still the same model as government aid. So I don't understand why they can can support this intergovernmental organization that's literally not a non-governmental organization when you're acting on behalf of countries. So it's exactly the same. They principally concede that this is good. But secondly, I want to engage with their principle really quickly because they basically say it's going to clash with taxpayers' interests. Two things. One, you need to explain to me why even if I go against taxpayers' interests and risk myself losing vote as a government, I would do this action because that's just not reasonable. Governments want to stay in power and therefore they will do things in coherence with what their taxpayers want and their civilians want. So there's no explanation as to why this will happen at all. But secondly, I would say human rights issues, like getting the most amount of aid in terms of monetary values to the less developing nations, is the most amount of principal good you can do in this debate. It doesn't matter what your taxpayers want or like the type of political beef that exists. If we can prove we get more money to less developed nations, we automatically win when human rights issues like being fed or having a job shouldn't be a politicized issue and should be the biggest priority in this debate. With that being said, 3 questions then. Firstly, which side gets more aid? Second of all, which side betters economic development? And lastly, who forwards social change? Firstly, who gets more aid? And here's where I want to point out how a lot of the benefits they talk about exist on our side of the house as well. Like one, the benefits of NGOs being discreet, efficient, localized, that exists equally when all the NGOs organizations they have talked about still exist in the status quo in conjunction to governmental aid that they source from completely different resources. Secondly, for corruption, right? Even if they can prove where there is corruption existing, as long as we can prove you 1 or 2 dimes can slip through, that is still added money on top. And I don't think they did enough work to show you why corruption is only on our side of the house anyways. Because here's the thing, NGOs are also subjugated to corruption if there's truly an autocracy. They can easily confiscate property like we see in autocratic regimes like the one we're living in. They can easily tax NGOs and get rid of all this money. So the method, if it's talking about that, if it's a truly horrible dictator, you can always use corruption to get away the money that's being distributed through local officials. So the most important thing is about incentives. When it's a government actor versus a non-governmental organization, on which side is it easier for this dictator to come in and be corrupt? If it's a very localized, scatter organization they want to talk about, then they cannot really retaliate against Iran's supreme leader if he decides to swoop in and take all of your funding away and stop all your missions and take away your money in corruption. But if it is the United States or China, these large nations who are militaristically superior, they most likely engage in proxy wars with you anyways, and they can easily retaliate against you if you don't go with their order and do the projects they actually want to do. They can easily retaliate. So it's very, very not smart for them to be corrupt and take money on our side, but not so true on their side of the house. And at the end of the day, they also rebut this argument themselves, right? When they say altruism exists in governments when the EU was just trying to help. If there's truly cases of altruism, that means they won't try to make it corrupt. They won't let this government take money just because they want to. And therefore, even in these cases, there's still more money going by. So why do we win this clash about more money going to the developing world? One, because proposition hasn't shown to you why money is going to be equally used on their side of the house in terms of humanitarian aid. In governmental aid, I have control over who it goes to, how it works, what projects I want to fund. If they say only NGOs exist and that's the only source, as a government, I'm going to be donating less money or no money at all, knowing that I'll have less control over this money. So they have to take a trade-off if they don't want to engage us, that they're going to have less money going to developing world on their side of the house. But even if they prove to you that NGOs are so much more superior, they still haven't engaged my first speaker's argument that NGOs funding and donations will also increase on our side. When nation-to-nation aid means people resonate with another country's people more when they're under the governmental narrative that we're allies, that we are brothers on the BRI, and therefore are more prone to donate individually to that nation as well. So regardless of what they prove and what they do not engage, we win this clash about getting more money to the developing world, which I would say is the most important thing. But secondly, on the second clash about bettering economic development. Now, this is assuming their best case scenario, which they haven't even proven, why the same amount of money will exist on both sides of the house. Just on their side, it's only through humanitarian aid because NGOs can't do things like building roads, building trade deals and ports across nations, versus our side has developmental aid and humanitarian aid. Why is there still unique benefit in having some developmental aid? It is because of 2 things we talked about. One, that it is way more sustainable, that it's not just about short-term release or one-time payment from these scattered organizations, but even when the social media hype decreases around your area and humanitarian aid doesn't come in, you still have your road, you still have your factory, you have your energy center and ports that you can still use to make an income, which is way more sustainable, and that's a unique value to long-term benefits of developmental aid. And secondly, you build up economic alliances, because in a globalized world, it's it's very important that you can sign deals with like US and China. That's when they bring you into NAFTA, bring you to NATO, and bring you to other trade deals in the UN and have a floor for you to voice out your concerns. And so this means we establish ties between nations when government to government aids exist. Versus on their side, this tie is not established, then how are you going to incorporate new nations into the world of globalized markets? They do not get that benefit on their side of the house as well. So even if it's the same amount of money, the unique existence of developmental aid on our side still wins opposition the debate. But more importantly, we went above and beyond that by showing you governments have way better incentives in terms of their own like trade, like aid and all these things that they do. Because they just dismiss this by saying, what does Uganda have to offer? Uganda has a lot to offer, like natural resources, which is being depleted in the US and China due to over like production, right? They have a manufacturing economy to support labor to the tertiary economy of these developed nations. I would say this is economic partnership because they complement each other very well. But more importantly, even if they're economically weaker, they can supply alliances, votes in the UN. And that's why US and China are scrambling to get alliances in the Middle East and BRI because they do have something to offer. So that's a positive incentive saying, I do want to help you, so you will stand on my side truly. But moving on, I don't think they ever proved why NGOs aren't self-serving. Because even though under the campaign, it might be like really altruistic, but it's still about feeling good as a donor or you satisfying your moral quota and feeling like you're a good person. So how is that a long-term sustainable good incentive? Versus on our side, I think if you screw up a nation, there's international call-out, there's PR against the competence of your nation, there's a decrease in morale, and that means overall this bigger nation will want to try to do a better job on our side of the house. For developing nations, right, they assume that these people are stupid when they choose deals with larger nations. That's why they're in debt traps and stuff. But these organizations aren't all dictatorships, and even when they are, they still care about basic social security, that they want to take good deals so people don't go into like riots and like revolutions against the government's orders, right? So I don't think they can just dismiss the developing nations as being stupid or corrupt or incompetent to their people when they have systematic reasons as to why they want the economy to flourish and they want their people to at least be safe. The last class is about social change, and here's where we exclusively bring you a mechanism for change, because humanitarian aid is one of the only soft power tools in terms of pushing for liberalization, because it's not as threatening as sanctions or militaristic threats, which will further the anti-West sentiment really like prevalent in the developing world, which will stunt progress against like them listening to us and instituting progressive changes. This is a carrot where we say we'll give you humanitarian aid if you do small changes, and that's when they see us as less threatening, and that's when they will actually listen to us. And that's why we help exactly who they want to help, by removing stoning laws in Uganda against LGBTQ individuals, by removing the guardian laws in Saudi Arabia against women. These are the things that we can do. Even if we prove that no money goes to the people, we still save the most vulnerable by removing all of these systematic barriers. They have way less aid on their side, and this money is the solely most important thing. We want to help people on the ground, which is why we're so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition speaker. And now we continue with the reply speeches. Opposition reply speaker goes first.
Am I audible, visible?
You are.
Wonderful. Opposition has no moral qualms with leveraging the greed and the political incentives of richer countries if that means that people get fed on the ground. If that means that finally these countries no longer have to delegate themselves to perpetual poverty, but can finally actualize as a country that can be respected on the global stage. I'm going to cover this debate in two clashes. Firstly, in terms of the source of aid, and secondly, in terms of the destination of aid. But before that, I want to fix the comparative to you very quickly. And I think it's quite disappointing that even though it's the quarterfinals, I still have to fix this debate in the reply. Firstly, let's take a look at the quantity of aid. We told you that there will always be an amount of aid that is tied to political goals. And we told you three mechanisms for that in terms of quid pro quo, in terms of political incentives, in terms of conflicting ideologies. Now, they say that people are going to be altruistic, and there is some degree of that. Listen, even if that does exist, that does not counter the fact that there is some degree of aid that is done exclusively for a purpose to push an agenda, and you get rid of that when governments no longer feel like they can use aid as a bargaining chip, they can use aid as a leverage, or they can use aid as a way to build influence because it doesn't go through them anymore. So they do lose that aid on their side of the house. So when you're judging the prop case, you have to take all of their impacts and multiply them by like 1/10 because of the fact they just get less aid on their side of the house. Secondly, you have to look at the delineation of aid. That we were totally okay with NGOs facilitating humanitarian aid for all the reasons they said. And this was not a concession in any sense, because in the status quo, this is how the world works. That there is a balance of countries and actors that do these types of aids when they fit the different type of goals. But there are structural reasons as to why some actors are better suited to some things and some other actors are better suited to other things. So in terms of development, then, you have to look on our side of the house. And thirdly, in terms of the existence of development. So even if they do get things such as the IMF and the World Bank, which is an incredibly late mechanism coming out from GovWhip, I would say that that doesn't match the fact that on the comparative, we told you why the biggest quantity of aid, that is aid that comes from countries in terms of development, gets ripped away on their side of the house. And even if we do concede that our humanitarian aid is worse for some reason, for some unknown reason to us, that we were the only side to you that did weighing as to why development was so important in the status quo in terms of long term, in terms of democratization, in terms of economic development, to evolve your democracy and to evolve your markets on a whole. So even if we were to only stand on the leg of development, that we were still okay with taking that comparative because we were the only side to prove to you as to why that is more important. Firstly, then, let's look at source. So governments are better because they have larger capacity, and this is a very simple model that we gave you, that money, manpower, political tools, and regional connection means that they are better than any other actor, any other alternative they can bring up, whether it's the NGOs or whether it's the IMF. So in that sense, even if these countries or even if these other actors did want to develop these countries, they don't have the ability to do so. But in terms of the accountability of it, I would say that their argumentation of fear-mongering China is way too lax in this debate and is lazy argumentation in terms of all the mechanisms and incentives we gave you as to why countries have an incentive to help and why it is the developing countries, the recipients of aid, that are the ones that hold all the leverage. Because of mutualism, you want to develop regional blocks, you want to have alliances, you want to have diplomatic friends, and you want to access those markets. In terms of PR, that countries are put under heavy scrutiny when they undergo massive projects like the BRI that have to undertake new people that come in, and those new people are going to come in if you're being an asshole to everybody. But thirdly, in terms of competition, that there is a race to the top in which instead you compete for how much aid you can give these individuals. So in that sense, I do not think there is any question about the incentives or the capability of government to enact the type of aid that we're talking about. But secondly, in terms of destinations, and they never proved the crucial link as to why all countries that receive aid are dictatorships. And I think it's a fundamentally flawed premise that is also a little offensive to people who live in the global south. But secondly, that even if this framing was true, that it probably was symmetric, because their contradiction was to say that these people don't feel threatened when NGOs come in, when their mechanism for them stealing was never threatened. It was for them to like hold their powers, for them to have greed or just want to steal money or those type of things. We don't know why those incentives don't apply on their side of the house. But importantly, the power of governments is something that we explained to you why it was more important, the military backing of the United States. So if you want to look at the comparative in this debate, which is how development actually gets given on our side of the house, we're the only side that can protect that to you. We're the only side that can provide a tangible impact, and currently proud to stand in opposition.
I'd like to thank the opposition reply speaker, and now for the final speech of this debate, I'd like to invite the proposition reply speaker.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, yes.
It's pretty ridiculous at the end of this debate to be called out by side China, telling us that we didn't have engagement on their side of the house, when in fact, two of our substantives and all of our principles went completely unanswered throughout this debate. Here to show you one last time why side proposition is the only side that actually managed to prove their burden in this case. Here's my reply. First of all, I'd like to address the completely new content that came in the last op speech, which we had no time to rebut, so I have to do it now. The fact is that in the third op, there comes this entirely new idea about how countries will not do stupid or bad jobs with foreign aid in these different countries because of two reasons. The first one being about how taxpayers will not be happy about it, and second, how it doesn't actually give them anything good. But seriously, taxpayers have no idea what's actually going on in countries such as Uganda or any of these countries where foreign aid is actually going to. And we have given you literally an example in our very first speech, which was never answered to, about how exactly this happened in the beginning of the 21st century, where people were starving in Ethiopia, and all the countries of the West gave them money, and Ethiopia just gave the money to their ruling party, and nothing happened. There was actually nothing, in no way that they could be prevented. So corruption, once again, overruled. That's what happened on our side of the house. Now, let me show you why we won. And so basically, what side China has been telling us this whole time is the fact that if they manage to prove even like a little significant thing that something good can get out of foreign aid, they have won this debate. But the fact is that we have proved you a unique harm, because when the third op comes and tell us that even if 1 or 2 dimes is added, that this is a benefit,
basic math, if 1 or 2 times added, that is all of the rest of the money that went through international aid that we have in fact lost. You, in this case, are conceding that in fact, all of this money was not nearly as efficient and that not all of it was used and would be able to use, which means that on our side of the house, if all of it gets used, which you have never proved that it doesn't by NGOs, that means more aid on our side of the house, more money, more people getting everything that they should be getting. Now, let's look at the whole comparative between IMF and between it being done directly by countries. And note that, again, in the second minutes of our first speech, you heard why this debate wouldn't be about IMF. The fact is that the incentive of the IMF is to actually get their money back because they help these countries by giving them, by the only condition that they actually give them is to open them as their trade and so, but they don't give them political conditions the way countries like China do. Because what does China actually want? China wants them to trap them into being burdened to them and to have to answer them constantly economically. They want the people to stay undeveloped and uneducated and so, and they just want to push their own markets, their own products onto their market because they are indebted to them because they all built one bridge, but now they have to pay it off for the rest of their lives. So the comparative on our side of the house, even no matter if it's humanitarian aid or IMF or whatever, is that we don't have this huge geopolitical problem that you actually have and then you keep saying is actually good, because that is the moment when countries can be abused, and that is exactly the example that you've been pushing throughout this debate, and we have proven to you that the Belt and Road is the worst one you could have possibly had, and since it was the only one you had, this point goes on our side of the house because the geopolitical thinks it makes no sense. So lastly, why is humanitarian aid and everything that we are the ones who only prove to actually so important? Because it doesn't matter if you have 1,000 new bridges, if your people are uneducated. It doesn't matter if the gays and the women in your country still are not considered normal citizens and are getting stoned when they actually leave their house. And this is something that was never addressed on your side of the house, because no dictator who actively hates these minorities would ever actually do anything to help him. And he would never do anything to help the people lift themselves out of poverty if it means that they could actually realize that he's a bad dictator who they could then remove from power. Only on our side of the house are all of these unique benefits that about helping the people ever going to be possible. So because of all of this, I have never been more proud to propose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the proposition reply speaker and to everyone for this nice debate. Now, debaters, please wait here. We will come back with the call and a short OA. And judges, can you please all move to the Discord channel, to the voice channel debate 4, so one of the emergency debate rooms, because it doesn't seem we have a breakout room here where we can discuss. So let's move to Discord and then we'll have extra stuff there. But make sure that you mute yourself and yeah, mostly mute yourself here on Zoom in case you want.
Actually, if you prefer, I can make a breakout room for you.